Alright everyone, the main video today was Twitter related, and this sort of relates to that actually. This wasn't until Twitter decided to go completely apeshit last night on a Trump tweet. This was going to be the main video, which is that Trump is now planning to use executive action to address the problem of tech censorship. He always frames it as a Republican, as censorship of conservative voices. It goes well beyond that. We've seen censorship for political reasons of far-left groups that were, the advertisers started getting nervous, I guess, about Cop Block and some of these other generally left-wing groups. Facebook purged a bunch of them. Libertarian groups, nationalistic groups that wouldn't be described as conservative, including the new so-called alt-right, which is basically racist communists at certain times. Certain people, it's been pointed out to me that that's a fringe of the alt-right. Okay, very well. It encompasses several well-known voices within this particular so-called community, and it's very funny to me. It's ironic to call yourself on the right when you're basically espousing National Bolshevism. I find that funny. Anyway, here's what I would ask. And Twitter literally proving Trump's point on the eve of him doing this is hysterical and amusing and very ironic, very charming for Twitter to help him that way. We've got to ask ourselves, though, are we actually going to hold these tech giants to account for existing legislation that blocks them from being generally sued for user content? The whole idea is this. In order to have a site like Facebook, where you get a billion people around the world, they got profiles, the site is literally about them making content and interacting with things. And companies and so forth, which are, again, built out of individuals that often use that service on a personal level too. Legislation already exists to allow companies that are primarily platforms in that sense to escape lawsuits over illegal content. For instance, someone posts terrorist material. Someone posts illicit porn. You can't sue Facebook for its existence as long as there's reasonable attempts to moderate that material. But nothing's perfect. Congress said it would be impossible for these firms to exist at all, and thus the U.S. would lose tech supremacy. Silicon Valley would be tumbleweeds, essentially, if we were to allow them to get sued by everyone who wanted to sue them for this user-generated content, if we held them accountable for what individuals did on these sites. YouTubers making YouTube videos, people on Facebook with their profiles, their messages, people on Twitter making tweets, tweeting out images, tweeting out links. Those are all protected in the sense legally of those companies. The user is responsible for the generated content, not the firm. The firm is a platform, essentially. Under this legislation, they are not supposed to unduly editorialize the content. Trump is making the point, therefore, I guess in his draft order, that essentially at the moments that they begin editorializing political content that is not illegal, that is not specifically obnoxious in the sense of being botting or spam or harassment or something. It's something that would fall outside of the scope of protected communication, something that wouldn't be protected under the First Amendment in the explicit sense. Insofar as content that would be protected, simple opinions, simple statements that don't target an individual or so forth, so, the person's political or religious ideology, criticism of religion, blasphemy, literally speaking. They are editorializing, and at that moment they are a publisher, which means that they are at risk of losing their legal protection. What Trump appears ready to do is try to use money in order to control these tech firms. I support this move. I would rather there be an expansion of the Constitution. I would like a constitutional amendment. Here's what I want. I want a red wave to give us a Republican House and Senate, and for Trump to go all in on populism and crush out censorship by simply doing this. Have a constitutional amendment that extends the First and Fourth Amendment privileges and rights down to the users of these sites in the general sense. Go above simple legislation and using money and rambling about editorializing. No, stop them by making it clear that insofar as these sites platform government services like USGS alerts, they platform government workers who are taxpayer funded, American citizens cannot be banned off these platforms for otherwise legal, non-obnoxious behavior. Obnoxious in the sense of spamming or botting. That's not a form of speech. That's an attempt to block speech. It's the equivalent of you showing up at someone else's speech and trying to shout them down. In and of itself, that's not really protected by the First Amendment. Same thing as like yelling fire in a crowded theater. We always hear that, terroristic threats and so forth. Beyond that, though, simple political opinions, even if they are themselves obviously bigoted, hateful, hate speech is a big buzz term, why should they be banned? A person should not, banking. People are being blocked from banking for mundane political opinions. And this oftentimes is affecting mainline conservatives. You'd think about someone like Laura Loomer, who outside of maybe parts of the diplomatic sense really just sounds like an 80s Republican to me. Maybe with more anti-gun rhetoric and an actual fixation on fiscal conservatism beyond what you'd get from like a Romney or a Bush or something. But you know, the views on Israel being center stage at times, very much the literal GOP is a standard Republican. Those views aren't that far outside of the main line of the so-called right wing. You've got people on the left that have mundane views, and they get and they end up getting targeted by flagging raids sometimes by the far left. The far left gets targeted. Half of the pages that Facebook purged last year when they went on their purging spree were left-wing. They were like progressive. There weren't any neoliberal or standard conservative sites. They were all three things: nationalistic pages, libertarian pages, and progressive pages, things like Cop Block and stuff like that. Especially anything to do with police accountability, which is amusing given the George Floyd case. Against the backdrop of what's happening right now in Minneapolis, now's not the time for more tech censorship. Twitter proved Trump's point, literally a few hours ago, by fucking blocking one of his tweets most of the way and saying this violates our policy on glorifying violence, but it's in the public's interest for it to be there. Well, you know, again, as I explained in my first video today, you can't remove it because it's part of the public record. It's already illegal for Twitter to do that, which is hysterical because it has to be there for posterity because it's a communication from the chief executive and the court's already weighed in on this. I think that should be extended to every other government good, service, and figure. Now, we need to ask ourselves, and a lot of times people get fixated on, well, they're private companies, which is semi-true, not really. There's legislation that gives them an artificial monopoly. There are strings attached. They platform taxpayer-funded services. When I paid my taxes, some dollars of that tax money went into the pockets of the people that are using Twitter and services that are provided thereupon. And the same on Facebook pages, YouTube videos, and so forth. Educational content paid for by government grants. I paid for that. I have an inalienable right to equally access that information, the same as any other American citizen, and yet in some cases that's not respected and upheld by these companies. They are not entirely private. If they were entirely private and only cared about the profits, why would they ban anyone from their sites? They'd want to be as expansive as possible. They would amalgamate together and they would all say fuck you to the advertisers, and the advertiser money would keep coming because it wouldn't matter if they maintain their brand's cleanliness or family-friendly nature if there's no alternative. Now, is there? It'd be very funny. It'd be funny when Nike starts taking out ads on BitChute. They're like, well, you know, that YouTube over there is getting too edgy for us. We need a cleaner platform, man. It'd be pretty funny. We need to get beyond, though, the legal side and into the I would say, the ethical and historical side, which is what our founders suggest, that groups that have monopolistic control over communication should act in the same manner that they were worried governments would act in. I argue no. I would argue that the concept of corporations, artificial monopolies back then, coming from government, the term itself in the British sense, the initial sense, has to do with chartering companies at the centralized level in an almost socialistic manner, centrally designed by government, in which people could personally profit from productivity, but they needed a charter to do that. We're basically doing that with Silicon Valley. It's essentially the same as the old British system. These companies technically have been chartered by government. They could not exist in the legal sense if it weren't for legislative protection, giving them effectively artificial monopolies. And people need to understand that. The other part is ethical. Do we want to live in a country where communication of a political nature is being strangulated by billionaires? Why would anybody on the left suggest that that was a good idea? I hear it all the time from like Bernie fans and stuff, and it's like, you're nuts. You don't even understand your own ideology at that point. That's about all. Peace out.